Here, therefore, consciousness, or the mode in which essence is for consciousness itself, that is, its shape, is in fact identical with its self-consciousness. This shape is itself a self-consciousness. It is thus at the same time an object in the mode of immediate being, and this being likewise immediately has the significance of pure thought, of absolute being. The absolute being which exists as an actual self-consciousness seems to have come down from its eternal simplicity, but by thus coming down it has in fact attained for the first time to its own highest essence. For it is only when the notion of essence has reached its simple purity that it is the absolute abstraction, which is pure thought, and hence the pure individuality of self, just as, on account of its simplicity, it is also the immediate or being. What is called sense consciousness is just this pure abstraction. It is this thinking for which being is the immediate. Thus, the lowest is at the same time the highest. The revealed, which has come forth wholly onto the surface, is precisely therein the most profound. That the Supreme Being is seen, heard, etc., as an immediately present self-consciousness. This, therefore, is indeed the consummation of its notion. And through this consummation, that being is immediately present qua Supreme Being. Paragraph 760, it's not all that long, and it might be tempting to skim through it because there's all this metaphysical, typical Hegelian language, and there's some really cool stuff that happened in the paragraph just prior to it, which is a longer paragraph, and there's a lot of similarly cool stuff that is being revealed, being opened up in the paragraph following it, 761, which is also a longer paragraph. And, might be a time for a little bit of a digression, thinking about what do we do when we're reading this text. And there are some times when it may seem like Hegel is going down a blind alley or wasting our time dithering about before he gets to what we could call the main point. What are you really getting at, Hegel? And, I won't say that that's never, ever the case. That's definitely not the case here in this paragraph. There are some important things that are being worked through and worked out, but we would have to think about the implications of them, as well as wrapping our head around what it is that Hegel himself is saying. And, you could think of this in a way as Hegel himself thinking through these matters, getting them arranged before he moves back into the flow of the text and gets a bit more specific about what's going on. And what is going on here? Well, we are talking about incarnation, as we've already seen in the previous paragraph. And when we talk about this term incarnation, what are we referencing? Well, what Hegel considers to be the revealed religion, one of several revealed religions, but also the absolute religion, Christianity. And you might say that in some respects, Hegel is like that old joke about the guy who says, when I talk about religion, I mean Christianity. And when I talk about Christianity, I mean Protestant Christianity. And when I talk about Protestant Christianity, I think the way the old saying goes is, I'm thinking of the Church of England. So there's like this specifying going on. Now, is it merely doctrinal controversies and polemics that's motivating Hegel? No, he does think of Christianity as putting something new, and you might even say unique, or, to use one of the words that we've got here, individual, Einzelheit, right, individuality, onto the table. And incarnation is different than other religious perspectives, which might say, God will reveal himself to all different people in different ways at different points in time. And, the revelation could be in terms of something coming down from on high, some primal word or some writings, hey, take this down, here's some dictation from God or from an angel, or pick whatever you want. Or it could be the revelation of and through a person. And that's what we're talking about here, and that's what we were talking about in the previous paragraphs, and that's where we're going in the next paragraphs. So one of the key questions that we can ask before we jump into the text is, how often and where is this self-revelation through a kind of lowering, a kind of entering into the world, the eternal entering into time, if we would like to use Kierkegaard's own framing of this in Philosophical Fragments, where he has a philosopher talking about this sort of stuff, right? And Kierkegaard is a critic of Hegel, but Kierkegaard is also taking some stuff from Hegel. Can this happen in multiple times, in multiple places? I mean, one way of thinking about this is, well, God is so good that, or the divine, or whatever it is so good that it sends these revealers, these self-revealers, throughout the cosmos, into maybe multiple worlds and multiple places in time. And Hegel is saying, just once. Just once is in a certain way more essential, more God-like than understandings where there are multiple revelations. All right, so that's enough going back and forth about that. Let's jump into the text. So we got something really interesting happening in the very first couple sentences. Here, therefore, consciousness, Bewusstsein, right? Or, he says, the mode, the Weise, in which essence, Wesen, is for consciousness itself. So the way in which essence or being, in this case the supreme being, is for consciousness, its shape, its Gestalt, right? It's a pregnant word right there, is what? Here's where the English can be a little bit misleading. Is identical, is equal to its self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein. And not just self-consciousness in general, but its self-consciousness, right? So consciousness and self-consciousness are, now on this term gleich, which we've talked about many times in earlier paragraphs, yes, identical can work as a translation, equal can also work, but we could also say equivalent to could work. Its consciousness is equivalent to its self-consciousness. And what does that actually mean for us? Well, Hegel goes on and develops this. This shape, this Gestalt, is itself a, notice the term there, a self-consciousness. It is thus, he says, at the same time an object, a Gegenstand, right, in the mode of immediate being, and this being likewise immediately. Now, notice this very important term that kind of qualifies things. Does he go on and say, this being is pure thought, is absolute being? No. This being, he says, has the significance, or we might say the meaning, right? The meaning of pure thought and absolute being. Now, what is doing that? Well, it's the self-consciousness. And here we ought to pause for a second. Think back to the self-consciousness section. What are some of the key things that we know about self-consciousness? Self-consciousness does not exist as an isolated monad by itself. Self-consciousness always exists and has itself in another self-consciousness and its relation with that self-consciousness and that self-consciousness's relation with itself. And what is it that self-consciousness is looking for? What is it that it desires? Right? What does it hunger for? What is its Begierde for? It is for recognition or acknowledgement, anerkennen. And this recognition early on in the self-consciousness section is a rather crude thing that we see being worked out in interpersonal dynamics and economics and political relations of master and slave. And then we have stoicism, skepticism, unhappy consciousness. This recognition raises itself and becomes more complex over and over again throughout the reason. Mostly you could say it's there in the phrenology and physiognomy section as what's missing, right? And then we see it there as well in the sections where we're talking about lived, practical, philosophical points of view. And then we get into the spirit section, and it's looking for it there. And then we get into religion, and religion is also a craving, a looking for recognition in relationship to another self-consciousness. So if that self-consciousness could be God, then maybe we can get the recognition we're really, really looking for as believers or worshipers or followers. Maybe we can have the certainty and the truth that we've been seeking for all of this time. All right, so again, a digression. Back to the text again. This object, this being, has the significance or the meaning, the Bedeutung of pure, reine, thought, denken, or of absolute being. And being here is not sein, being here is Wesen, the essence that we were talking about here, the essence that is for consciousness. All right, so this is pretty complex already. Now he goes on and he says, here's where we get this important transition. The absolute being, which exists as an actual self-consciousness. Okay, how does it exist as an actual self-consciousness? This is where we have to talk about a coming down to our level, us miserable human beings. This is an overcoming of the unhappy self-consciousness, or the unhappy consciousness, which earlier in the religion section, Hegel did call the unhappy self-consciousness. So a little slip of the lip there that works out quite well. What's going on? In order for God not just to be substance, in order for God not just to be self, in order for God not just to be subject of predicates, God has to be self-consciousness. Can God be self-consciousness for us without taking on flesh, without adopting a persona? And not just a person like God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, as we talk about in Trinitarian Christian theology, but a genuine persona as a human person. I mean, this is worth thinking about. Can we ascribe self-consciousness to God or to gods without kind of mythologizing? I mean, think about the Greek myths. Gods are basically sort of like superhuman human beings, and they do human-like stuff like screw around on each other and get in fights and trick each other. And, they're not like speculating about the very nature of the universe. I mean, Zeus administers justice, but in kind of a slipshod way. What about the biblical God? The God encountered through first the Hebrew Scriptures and then later on in testimony. Well, this is where it gets different, right? Because that Jesus fellow is, at least in the Christian Scriptures, at least in the canonical ones, and even in a lot of the non-canonical ones, supposed to be God. A self-consciousness who lives like one of us. Maybe not completely like one of us, right? How many of you are carpenters, for example, right? How many of you turn water into wine? Not all. I mean, I've never done that. I've done some carpentry in my time, but the other stuff, not so much, right? All right, back to the text once again. So, Hegel tells us the absolute being, which exists as an actual self-consciousness, seems to have come down. Herabgestiegen. Sort of like climbing down, there's an activity involved there. Coming down from what? Coming down from its eternal, ewige, right? Everlasting simplicity. It's Einfachheit. And so we have an interesting contrast of heights here. Height being the suffix which makes something into kind of like a noun, a substantive state. So we have Einfachheit, the unity, or the simplicity, right? Einfach, simple, literally folded once, right? And then Einzelnheit, right? Individuality. And it's going to be both of those, but it comes down from one to the other. So he says, by coming down, it has attained for the first time to its highest essence. Well, this is actually kind of mind-blowing. Let's think about this for a minute. Hegel is not saying that God coming down to us poor slobs here, the eternal entering into time, again, to use this wonderful way of expressing it, God coming into history is another way of framing it. This doesn't mean that God is doing this as a mere concession, like, well, I made the world, made all these people, I'm way up here, things are going haywire down here, I got to send like a messenger, an avatar or a representative or something like that down there. No, Hegel is saying this is a more developed, higher, more to its essence conception of the divine on the part of human beings. So he goes on and he says, it's attained for the first time its highest essence only when the notion, the Begriff, the concept of essence has reached its simple purity, that it is the absolute abstraction which is pure thought, and hence the pure individuality of self, just as, on account of its simplicity, it's also the immediate or being. So something is happening here in this coming down, this condensation of God within the human world, not just within the world, not just entering as sort of a blip that then takes on human flesh. No, God coming into human culture and at a particular place, at a particular time, with a particular social milieu, right? So, what does God come down as? This immediately present, the immediate isn't actually in there in the German, it's just Seiendes, right? Being, self-consciousness, a self-consciousness of a human being, Jesus Christ, we're going to find out, right? Somebody who is going to be carrying out teaching and ministry and providing us with all sorts of puzzles and parables and paradoxes to think about, and teaching a way of life and making decisions and eating food and, presumably also doing things like, bathing himself and going to the bathroom and chit-chatting with people about random stuff, right? This is God entering into our matrix of self-consciousness, at least for those who are there, right? Because then he goes on and he says, what is called sense consciousness is just this pure abstraction. It is this thinking for which being is the immediate. And this, think back to not self-certainty, sense certainty, right? The very first substantive section of this after the preface, after the introduction. And it turns out that, what we take to be the thing in itself, there's always much more to it, and we go through this entire consciousness section to figure that out. Well, something like that is happening here because we can actually see this person. Now, there's some, transformations, you could say, or transvaluations, if you like, going on here as well. The lowest is at the same time the highest. So, the first shall be last, the last shall be first. Is this a reference to that verse? Not necessarily, but that is certainly part of the dynamic. The lowest is some guy who sweats and stinks sometimes and goes around and maybe, when he preaches the Sermon on the Mount, stutters a bit. We don't actually know. What we know are the accounts provided of him, probably idealized in the Gospels. Remember, too, that Hegel in his time, there is a lot going on with thinking through these texts. The higher criticism is coming into being, and people are saying, well, these might not be perfectly accurate depictions of what was going on. They might be conditioned by the culture in which this is taking place, and by literary conventions and all sorts of things like that. So there's one thing, the lowest is the same time the highest. The revealed which has come forth wholly on the surface is also the most profound. There is a depth to this self-revealing God who has taken place in human, society and life, and what he seems to be doing on the surface might contain a great depth. I mean, do we have to assume that for every single thing, every single word that is preserved? Maybe not. Maybe some of the time he was just joking around with his friends. And, like Freud says, maybe sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. We don't have to symbologize everything. But you don't know until you start thinking about it, do you? Until you start probing into it. So he says, the supreme being, this is the supreme being, this self-consciousness, is seen and heard as an immediately present self-consciousness. This, therefore, is the consummation of its notion. The notion of the divine in relation to human beings, in relation to self-consciousnesses, consciousnesses and self-consciousnesses, fused together, which is part of the religion section at the very beginning, trying to figure out what the hell is this God, what surpasses us, what exceeds us, what teaches us how we ought to live and how we ought not to live, what can give us guidance. That's being heard and seen, at least by those in proximity. I mean, afterwards we get testimony. Things are talked about, written down, stories are circulated around. But for some, there is this immediately present capacity, and that's a consummation. So, Vollendung, right? We could also say perfection. We could also say the fulfillment, right? Being brought to its telos, its end. Revealing itself in the process, revealing what the telos of the divine actually is. This is really interesting stuff, isn't it? Because, again, think about, it might not be completely unique to Christianity. Maybe the revelation of God as love is also connected to the notion of the divine as compassion, as we find in other religions, right? But this is in a person who is love incarnate, who is truth incarnate. And this is a bringing this notion of essence to its fulfillment. Again, this is supposed to be like the consummate religion, the fulfilled promise of religion. And so he says, through this consummation, that being is immediately present, qua supreme being. For those who hear and see and believe and live in connection, even if they don't fully understand, this is God itself revealing it as person, as self-consciousness, who they can engage. And this is a very powerful thing. This is for Hegel, an important transformation of human possibility and human history. This is not just an idea. This is a lived reality for people of being in contact with God in a radically new way that they barely can wrap their heads around, but which is going to play a massively important role in what follows and in human history. So, again, I want to go back to something I was saying at the beginning. There's actually a lot going on in this paragraph if we go under the surface of just talking about metaphysics, and we sandwich it in between these two longer, in some respects more concrete paragraphs that are perhaps on the surface much more interesting. This turns out to be a really important stopping point for us to consider what is going on here for human self-consciousness in relation to a divine self-consciousness that is able to be self-consciousness by becoming human, by taking on flesh, by taking on place and time, by taking on all the things that make us what we are.